The frozen wilderness of Montana is no place for the weak, where winter's chill conceals as much danger as beauty, life, and death dance on Therazor's edge. A lone bobcat cub, alone and starving, too young to fend for himself, steps into a world far crueler than ever imagined. The shadows move, the snow whispers. He suddenly finds his world turned upside down. When a pack of wolves closes in, a wolf pack hardened by winter's grip has marked him as their next meal. But fate is unpredictable as the wolves close in, and all hope seems lost. An unexpected force intervenes, setting off a chain of events that defy nature's most ruthless rules. The wild reveals a twist that defies everything we think we know. Prepare to witness a story where survival instinct and courage collide in the icy grip of winter, leaving you questioning whether nature's balance can ever truly be restored. The bitter wind howled through the dense pine forest of northern Montana, carrying with it tiny crystals of ice that sparkled like diamond dust in the weak winter sunlight. It was early February, and the Flathead National Forest lay buried under 3/3 of snow. Its usual verdant expanse transformed into a stark white wilderness. In this unforgiving landscape, life and death played out their eternal dance with unrelenting regularity. For Max, a four-month-old bobcat cub, this dance had suddenly become terrifyingly real. His mother had disappeared 3 days ago while hunting, leaving him alone in their den beneath a fallen spruce. Hunger had finally driven him out into the open, his instincts wearing with his fear as he attempted to find food in a world that seemed determined to eliminate him. The young cub's reddish-brown fur, spotted with black rosettes, stood out starkly against the pristine snow as he cautiously made his way through the forest. His normally proud ears were flattened against his head, and his stub of a tail twitched nervously as it tested each step. At barely 12 pounds, Max was significantly smaller than an adult bobcat, his youth evident in his slightly gangly limbs and the remnants of kitten fluff still visible around his neck. 20 miles away in the small town of Whitefish, Montana, James Jim Harrison was preparing for what he thought would be a routine day of wildlife monitoring. At 58, Jim had spent the better part of 3 decades working as a wildlife biologist for the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department. His weathered face, creased by years of exposure to the elements, bore testament to countless hours spent in the wilderness. The silver threading through his dark hair and beard seemed to match the winter landscape he so often traversed. "You heading out today?" Dad Sarah Harrison's voice carried from the kitchen of their modest ranch-style home. At 28, she had followed in her father's footsteps, working as a veterinarian at the local wildlife rehabilitation center. Jim pulled on his heavy winter boots, nodding as he checked his gear. Got reports of increased wolf activity in the eastern sector. Need to check if they're getting too close to the ranches. He patted the tranquilizer gun in its holster, a tool he hoped he wouldn't need to use in all his years of service. Jim had always believed in minimal intervention, allowing nature to take its course whenever possible. Sarah appeared in the doorway holding out a thermos of coffee. "Be careful out there. The weather report's calling for another storm system moving in by afternoon." "Always, kiddo." Jim accepted the thermos with a smile, remembering how Sarah had earned her nickname, Kiddo, despite now being a grown woman with credentials that rivaled his own. "How's that young mountain lion doing at the center?" "Much better, should be ready for release by next week." Sarah's eyes sparkled with pride. The rehabilitation center had become her life's work, a calling that seemed to run in the family. As Jim headed out to his truck, the weight of his equipment familiar and comforting, he couldn't have known that this day would test everything he believed about natural selection and human intervention. Morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as he drove his Ford F-100 Fendi along the Forest Service road, its snow chains crunching rhythmically against the packed ice beneath. Meanwhile, Max had wandered farther from his den than ever before. The hunger gnawing at his belly had become impossible to ignore, driving him to take increasingly desperate risks. His mother had begun teaching him to hunt before her disappearance, but those lessons had barely scratched the surface of what he needed to know to survive on his own. The young bobcat's keen ear picked up the sound of small claws scratching against bark. A red squirrel, perhaps, or a pine marten. His instincts took over and he dropped into a crouch, his spotted coat helping him blend with the shadows of the forest. But as he prepared to stalk his potential prey, a different sound froze him in place. The soft crunch of multiple paws on snow approaching from several directions. The wolf pack had been tracking Max for the last hour to following his inexperienced trail, through the snow with practiced ease led by a battle-scarred alpha female. The locals had named Shadow for her dark gray coat. The pack had been pushed into new hunting territories by the harsh winter. Their usual prey of elk and deer had become scarce, forcing them to consider smaller quarry. They might normally ignore Max's fear. Scent filled the air as 5 wolves emerged from the trees, their movements coordinated with generations of hunting experience. Shadow took point, her amber eyes fixed on the young bobcat with predatory focusto. Her mate, a massive male, with a distinctive white chest, moved to cut off any escape route toward the deeper forest. 3 younger wolves completed the circle, their tongues lang as they anticipated an easy meal. The bobcat cub's heart hammered against his ribs as his eyes darted from one wolf to another. His mother had warned him about wolves, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of facing a pack alone. His small size, usually an advantage for moving through the forest's understory, now seemed like a cruel joke against these efficient killers. Jim Harrison had just finished checking his 3rd monitoring station when he heard a high-pitched cry of terror that cut through the winter air like a knife. 28 years in the field had taught him to recognize the vocalizations of every predator and prey species in the region. But this sound carried a note of desperate youth that made his chest tighten without conscious thought. He was moving through the forest, his snowshoes allowing him to traverse the deep drifts with practiced ease. The tranquilizer gun was in his hands, though he knew using it would be a last resort. Human intervention in predator-prey relationships was generally discouraged, but something about that cry had triggered a response deeper than professional protocol. The scene that greeted him as he crested a small rise made his breath catch in his throat. The wolf pack had a young bobcat cub cornered against a granite outcropping, the small feline's fur bristling as it tried to make itself appear larger. Jim recognized Shadow immediately. He had been tracking this pack for months, but it was the bobcat cub that captured his attention. The little fellow couldn't have been more than 4 months old, barely weaned and showing signs of malnutrition that suggested it had been alone for several days. Even as Jim watched, the cub swiped at the nearest wolf with surprising courage, though its claws found nothing. But airtime seemed to slow as Jim assessed his options. The professional in him knew that predation was a natural part of the ecosystem the wolves needed to eat, and nature could be cruel in its efficiency. But as he watched the young bobcat fighting against impossible odds, with such determination, he thought of all the animals Sarah had rehabilitated at the center of all the times a small intervention had led to something magnificent. Making his decision, Jim reached into his pack and pulled out a canister of wolf deterrenta, combination of sound and scent that he'd developed himself over years off-field researches. Shadow tensed for the final lunge. Jim activated the device and threw it into the space between the wolves and their intended prey. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The canister released a high-pitched frequency that wolves found particularly distressing, combined with a scent that mimicked their most feared natural competitors. Shadow's ears flattened against her skull, and she took several steps backward, her pack following her lead. Jim didn't waste the opportunity. Moving with deliberate confidence, he positioned himself between the wolves and the bobcat cub, his body language projecting authority rather than aggression. He had learned long ago that wolves were intelligent enough to assess risk versus reward, and his presence, combined with the deterrent, was quickly shifting that equation easy. "Now, Shadow," he spoke in a firm, calm voice, one hand raised while the other kept the tranquilizer gun ready. "There's easier prey out there for you and yours." The alpha female held his gaze for a long moment, and in that look Jim saw something that reminded him why he had fallen in love with wildlife work in the first place. There was calculation there, yes, but also intelligence and adaptation. After what seemed like an eternity, Shadow threw back her head and let out a short howl as one. The pack melted back into the forest, leaving only their tracks in the snow as evidence they had ever been there. With the immediate threat neutralized, Jim turned his attention to the bobcat cub, which had pressed itself against the rock face, its small chest heaving with exertion and fear up close. The signs of the cub's desperate situation were even more apparent, its ribs visible beneath its fur, its eyes showing the glassy look of dehydration. "Hey there, little fellow," Jim kept his voice soft and soothing as he slowly removed his outer jacket. "You've had quite a morning, haven't you?" The cubist weakly, more from fear than aggression. but didn't try to run as Jim carefully approached. Years of experience had taught him how to handle injured wildlife, and he could see that this cub was too exhausted and hungry to put up much of a fight with practiced movements. Jim wrapped his jacket around the small feline, creating a secure bundle that would keep both the cub warm and prevent it from scratching him as he lifted the package he was struck by. How light the animal was, far too light for a cub this age. "Sarah's going to love you," he murmured, already thinking of his daughter's reaction to this newest rescue. The storm clouds were gathering overhead as Jim made his way back to his truck, the precious bundle cradled against his chest. The drive to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was tense. With Jim constantly checking on his passenger, the cub had fallen into unexhausted sleep, its small body finally succumbing to the stress and fatigue of its ordeal. As he drove, Jim called ahead to the center, knowing Sarah would want to prepare for their arrival. "Dad, everything okay?" Sarah's voice crackled through the truck speakers. "Got a special delivery for you, kiddo, young bobcat. Cub probably 4 months old, severely malnourished and dehydrated, just rescued it from a wolf pack." There was a pause on the line. "Dad, you know, the protocol about predator-prey interactions." I know, but Sarah, this one's different. The mother's been gone for days. Based on its condition, it wouldn't have survived another day out there, wolves or no wolves." He could almost hear his daughter's professional resolve. "Weakening, bring it in through the back entrance. I'll have the examination room ready." The Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was a state-of-the-art facility, though its exterior remained deliberately modest, a large barn-like structure set back from the main road. As Jim pulled up to the back entrance, Sarah was already waiting, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the scrubs that had become her second skin. "Let me see our patient," she said as soon as Jim stepped out of the truck, her professional demeanor taking over. As he carefully unwrapped the jacket, Sarah's expression softened. "Oh, Dad, he's beautiful." The cubod awakened during the drive and now blinked at them with weary blue eyes. The color would change to yellow as it matured, they both knew. Despite its condition, there was still a fierce spark of life in those eyes that spoke to its will to survive. "Let's get him inside and checked out," Sarah said, leading the way. To the examination room, the next hour was a flurry of activity as they assessed the cub's condition. Sarah's skilled hands moved with gentle efficiency as she checked vital signs, drew blood samples, and began the process of careful rehydration. "Well, it's definitely a male," she announced as she worked. "About 4 months old, as you estimated, severe dehydration and malnutrition, but no serious injuries. Actually, Dad, considering everything he's been through, he's in remarkably good shape." Jim watched from the corner of the room, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "He's a fighter. That's for sure. You should have seen him facing down those wolves." Sarah looked up from her work, her eyes serious. "He'll need at least 2 months of rehabilitation before we can consider release, and that's assuming everything goes well. Does he have a name yet?" Jim asked, knowing his daughter's habit of naming special cases. Sarah studied the cub for a moment as she finished securing the line that would help rehydrate him. "Max," she said. "Finally, he looks like a Max to me." And so began Max's journey from desperate survivor to rehabilitation success story. The first week was critical with Sarah Hand, her team working around the clock to stabilize his condition. The cub proved to be an ideal patient, accepting treatment with a determination that seemed to mirror his will to survive in the wild. Jim visited every day, often bringing his field notes to update. While sitting in Max's recovery room, the cub seemed to recognize him, those intelligent eyes following his movements with increasing interest rather than fear. By the end of the second week, Max had gained enough strength to begin exploring his enclosure, his natural curiosity starting to overcome his initial weariness. As weeks turned into months, Max's recovery became something of a local sensation. Sarah had always been careful about maintaining professional distance from the animals in her care, knowing they would eventually return to the wild. But there was something special about Max. Perhaps it was the circumstances of his rescue. Or maybe it was the way he seemed to respond to human presence while maintaining his wild nature. Their rehabilitation process was methodical and carefully planned. As Max regained his strength, Sarah and her team began introducing elements that would help prepare him for eventual release. Live prey was provided in ways that would encourage his hunting instincts, and human contact was gradually reduced. to prevent. Imprinting Jim continued his regular monitoring of the wolf pack that had nearly ended Max's life, noting with professional interest how they had adapted their hunting patterns in response to the changing winter conditions. Shadow and her pack had successfully brought down an elk the week after the encounter with Max, proving that their attempt on the bobcat cub had indeed been born of desperate circumstances rather than normal behavior. As spring began to soften the Montana landscape, Max's release date approached. The cub had grown into a healthy young bobcat, his coat glossy and his muscles strong from months of controlled exercise. Sarah had selected a release site well away from known wolf territories, but within suitable bobcat habitat. The day of release dawned, clear and cool, with the first hints of spring visible in the tiny buds appearing on the trees. Jim and Sarah worked together to prepare Max for transport, both feeling the emotional we of the moment. Despite their professional experience, Sarah said as they drove to their lease site, Max secure in a transport carrier in the back of the truck. When you first brought him in, I wasn't sure if we were doing the right thing, natural selection and all that. Jim nodded, understanding completely. Nature can be cruel, but it can also be magnificent in its capacity for resilience. Sometimes all it needs is a small chance. The release site was perfect, a rocky area with plenty of cover and known populations of rabbits and other prey species. As they set up the carrier, Sarah performed one final check of Max's condition. Her movements efficient but gentle. Ready to go home, buddy, she whispered to the bobcat, who watched her with calm yellow eyes. They'd indeed changed color as he matured. The carrier door was opened, and for a long moment, Max simply sat there, scanning his new surroundings. Then, with the same determination he had shown in facing down the wolf pack months ago, he merged into the morning sunlight. He paused briefly, looking back at Jim and Sarah, and in that moment both father and daughter felt the full impact of what they had accomplished. Then Max was gone, disappearing into the undergrowth with the silent grace that made bobcats such effective predators. Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek, not bothering to hide it from her father. "You did good, kiddo," Jim said, softly putting an arm around her shoulders. "You did real good." In the months that followed, their wildlife cameras occasionally caught glimpses of a healthy young bobcat in the release area, its spotted coat unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Max had not just survived. He was thriving, his presence helping to maintain the delicate balance of the ecosystem. Jim often thought about that winter morning when he had made the decision to intervene. In a career spanning decades, it stood out as a moment when the line between professional protocol and compassionate action had blurred, leading to something extraordinary. The story of Max became a more than just a successful rehabilitation. It became a testament to the impact that human compassion could have, when guided by knowledge and respect for the natural world. Sarah kept a single photo in her office at the rehabilitation center, a striking image of Max on the day of his release, his proud stance and alert expression, capturing everything they had worked. Top reserve, that photo served as a daily reminder of why they did this work, often drawing the attention of visitors and new volunteers. 1 year after Max's release, Jim was conducting his regular wildlife surveys in the area when he came across something remarkable in a protected hollow beneath a rocky overhang. He found evidence of a bobcat den. As he carefully approached, using all his years of experience to move silently, he caught sight of a familiar form. Max, now fully grown, watching over 2 small cubs of his own. The young bobcat had not only survived but had found a mate and was now contributing to the next generation. Jim's trained eye could see that Max still bore the distinctive spot pattern that had made him recognizable during his rehabilitation, but now he moved with the confident grace of a mature predator. The cubs, barely visible in the shadows of the den, were proof of nature's resilience and the far-reaching effects of that one crucial intervention that evening. As Jim shared his discovery with Sarah over dinner, their conversation turned to the broader implications of their work. The rehabilitation center had grown over the years taking in more animals and training new staff in the delicate balance between assistance and natural processes. What to think about sometimes, Sarah said, pushing her plate aside and leaning forward. That morning with the wolves. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't made that split-second decision. Jim nodded, understanding the unfinished thought. One small action can ripple out in ways we never expect. Max's isn't just one rescued bobcat anymore. He's become part of the ecosystem's recovery story. The success of Max's rehabilitation and release had far-reaching effects beyond just one bobcat's life. The documentation of his case, carefully maintained by Sarah, became a valuable resource for their wildlife rehabilitation centers. Dealing with orphan predator CBS, the protocols developed during his care were refined and shared, helping to improve survival. ATs for other young animals in similar situations. The story also helped bridge the gap between the local ranching community and wildlife conservationists. When Sarah presented Max's case at a community meeting, focusing on the careful balance between predator conservation and human intervention, she found an unexpectedly receptive audience. Even some of the ranchers who had traditionally viewed predators as threats began to see the value in maintaining healthy wildlife populations 5 years after Max's rescue. The Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had become a model facility known for its successful rehabilitation and release programs. Sarah had expanded her role, training new veterinarians in wildlife care, while continuing to oversee critical cases. Jim, though officially retired, still conducted regular wildlife surveys, his expertise more valuable than ever in tracking the health of local predator populations. The wolf pack that had nearly ended Max's life remained in theory, though their numbers and territory had shifted over the years. Shadow, the alpha female, had produced several litters of pups, maintaining the pack's presence in the ecosystem. Jim's continued observations showed how the wolves had adapted to changing conditions, their hunting patterns evolving to focus more on traditional prey as deer and elk populations recover, said one crisp autumn morning. As Jim was checking his wildlife cameras, he came across tracks that told an extraordinary story. In the mud near a stream, he found the distinct prints of a wolf pack moving through the area and nearby similar but confident tracks of a bobcat, likely Max, having passed through the same space just hours apart. But unlike that desperate day years ago, these tracks showed no signs of pursuit or conflict. Instead, they were the normal movements of predators sharing the same territory, each filling their own niche in the complex web of forest life. This, Jim reflected, was perhaps the most powerful testament to their work. Not just the survival of one animal, but their restoration of natural balance. The forest could support both wolves and bobcats, each species playing its crucial role in maintaining the ecosystem's health. As he stood there studying those tracks in the early morning light, Jim heard a familiar sound, the soft patting of paws on fallen leaves. Looking up carefully, he caught a glimpse of amateur bobcat moving through the underbrush. The cat paused briefly, its yellow eyes meeting Jim's in a moment of recognition that seemed to transcend the usual boundaries between wild animals and humans. Whether it was Max or one of his offspring, Jim couldn't be certain, but it didn't really matter. What mattered was that the bobcat moved with the confidence of an animal, completely at home in its environment, neither fearful of humans nor dependent on them. This was the true measure of successful wildlife rehabilitation, not just saving an animal's life, but preserving its essential wildness. The bobcat disappeared into the forest as silently as it had appeared, leaving Jim with a profound sense of satisfaction. In his decades of wildlife work, he had seen both successes and failures, had witnessed the sometimes harsh realities of natural selection and the occasional need for human intervention. Max's story represented the perfect balance between these forces, a moment when human compassion, guided by scientific knowledge and respect for natural processes, had helped maintain the delicate equilibrium of the wild. Back at the rehabilitation center, Sarah was preparing for a new generation of wildlife professionals, teaching them the lessons learned from countless cases. Like Max's, the center had grown to include educational programs for local schools, helping to foster understanding and appreciation for wildlife in the community's youngest members. The key, she would tell her students, is knowing when to act and when to step back. Nature has its own wisdom, its own ways of maintaining balance. Our role is not to interfere with that balance, but to help restore it when human activities or extraordinary circumstances have disrupted it. The story of Max the bobcat cub, who faced down a wolf pack, survived against impossible odds, and went on to contribute to the recovery of his species, became more than just a tale of successful wildlife rehabilitation. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of nature's harshest reality, There was room for compassion, for intervention, guided by wisdom, and for the remarkable resilience of life itself. As the years passed, other animals would come through the sense doors, each with their own story of survival and recovery. But Max's story remains special, a testament to the difference that one moment of intervention, guided by knowledge and compassion, could make in the grand tapestry of wilderness preservation. The photo and Sarah's office continued to draw attention, sparking conversations about wildlife conservation and the role of humans in protecting and preserving the natural world. And somewhere in the forest of Montana, Max's legacy lived on through his offspring, their presence a vital part of the ecosystem's ongoing story of survival, adaptation, and renewal. Jim and Sarah's work had shown that, while nature could indeed be cruel, it could also be guided back toward balance when human intervention was applied with wisdom and restraint. Their story, intertwined with Max's, became part of the larger narrative of wildlife conservation in America, a reminder that every life saved, every animal successfully returned to the wild, contributed to the preservation of the natural heritage they all worked so hard to protect.